You're live. Go ahead.
All right. Welcome, everyone. I'm Charles Davidson, the publisher of the American Interest magazine, and we're very pleased to have you joining us today for this event about a remarkable report about Dubai. And I think I will leave it at that and pass the torch to Ben Judah, our editor-at-large, a very remarkable Franco-American journalist whom I imagine many of you have heard of. And he will be moderating this session and introduce our panelists, and off we go. Thank you, Ben.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Charles. My name is Ben Judah. I'm the editor-at-large of the American Interest, and it's my great pleasure to introduce here today a really esteemed panel on this vital topic, which is Dubai and the Emirates' role in illicit financial flows. The first panelist I'd like to introduce is Jodi Vittori. Jodi is a non-resident fellow with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the US Research and Policy Manager for Transparency International's Defense and Security Program. She is an expert on the linkages of corruption, state fragility, illicit finance, and US national security. Vittori is the author of Terrorist Financing and Resourcing, Palgrave Macmillan 2011, and co-author of the handbook Corruption, Threats, and International Missions, Practical Guidance for Leaders. Second panelist I'd like to introduce here today is Matthew T. Page. Matthew is a non-resident scholar with the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an associate fellow with the Africa Programme at Chatham House in London, and a non-resident fellow with the Centre for Democracy and Development in Abuja, Nigeria. He does consultancy work and co-authored Nigeria, What Everyone Needs to Know, Oxford University Press, 2018. Until recently, he was the US intelligence community's top Nigeria expert at the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He has also served on the National Intelligence Council as the Defense Intelligence and at the Defense Intelligence Agency, and as an International Affairs Fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Our next panelist is Lakshmi Kumar. Lakshmi is the Policy Director at Global Financial Integrity, GFI, a Washington, DC based think tank specializing in research, advocacy, and advisory services. Kumar works on issues of illicit finance and trade and the vehicles, systems, and institutions that facilitate movement of illicit money across borders. Last but not least, we are joined today by Karen Greenaway. Karen is an attorney at law who served more than 22 years in the US Federal Bureau of Investigation as both a special agent and supervisory special agent. She conducted and supervised investigations of transnational organized crime, money laundering, foreign bribery, and other corruption activities, focusing primarily on the former Soviet Union, Russia, and Central and Eastern Europe. She is now an independent consultant advising the Bureau, civil society, non-governmental organizations, and investigative journalists on the work of foreign corruption. So just to kick off our conversation today, our panel is based on looking at this recent report from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The title of the report is Dubai's Role in Facilitating Corruption and Global Illicit Financial Flows. And I'm especially glad to be hosting this discussion today following the important geopolitical step that the Emirates took in beginning a process of normalizing its relations with Israel a few days ago. So I think this is a great occasion for us to look at the other side of the coin of the Emirates' role in international relations. So I'd like to first ask Jodi Vittori to speak, maybe for about 10 minutes, just to introduce the key themes of the report and to kick off our discussion.
Great. No, thank you so much. Thanks to you, Ben. Thanks to Charles. Thanks to the American Interest magazine for hosting us today. It's exciting to be able to talk about Dubai's role in facilitating corruption and global financial flows, as you note, especially with everything going on. In April, the Financial Action Task Force also put out their evaluation of Dubai and put them on a watch list on money laundering issues. These will be coming to the forefront with COVID-19. Dubai is an economy that's based on trade. It's based on tourism. It's based on real estate and banking. And all of those are shrinking significantly because of COVID-19. And also, as you note, we've got this new trilateral US, Israel, UAE sort of geopolitical switch with UAE recognizing Israel and putting settlements on hold. And so all of this is going to be very interestingly wrapped up together as we speak. The reason we put this project together, and as you noted in the introductions, nobody here is specifically a Dubai expert, although we had many specific Dubai experts on this multidisciplinary report. And that's because my background in illicit financial flows and terrorism finance, and Matthews and everybody else on the panels, we all found the same sorts of things. No matter what kind of illicit financial flow cases one was working on, somehow the city-state of Dubai came up. Sometimes it might be more marginal, a bank account, a piece of real estate, a meeting in Dubai, something like that. But sometimes, and very often, they were very, very central to various criminal or corruption cases. And just to give an example, let's look at Angola and Isabel dos Santos. And her father had been the president and dictator of Angola, and he was out of power. And when he was in power, she had been put in charge of the Angolan state oil company, Sonangol, which is a major source of finance for the country. And she had found out one day that she was going to be fired from her job as the head of the state oil company. So by the end of the day, she had basically emptied the bank accounts of the Sonangol oil company in Europe, according to the New York Times. And by the end of that day, she had moved those funds through a variety of consulting firms and so forth to Dubai. And it was the kind of puzzle of why would somebody, if you have to empty bank accounts allegedly and move that money somewhere quickly, what makes you think of Dubai? How is it possible to move that so quickly to Dubai, especially given that she was such a politically exposed person through her history of concerns with corruption and so forth? So we really wanted to understand that puzzle. We also had the goal of stripping away some of Dubai's exceptionalism. We all think of Dubai as, Emirates is slashed across T-shirts of various, soccer clubs that, kids like to wear the jerseys of. And it's the world's tallest building. The Burj Khalifa is there, and it's very shiny, and it's known for its beach scene. And it's the kind of place where businesses have their, regional headquarters in Middle East, North Africa, and so forth. But we also wanted to better understand what was the role of the more illicit side of things in Dubai. There's a lot of very completely legal business going on, but there was clearly something going on as well on the illicit side that we wanted to better understand. And this report really complements, I think, the Financial Action Task Force reports of both 2009 and 2020 that both noted very significant shortcomings in Dubai's anti-money laundering regimes. And as I noted earlier, Dubai is on a one-year observation because they were found to have significant shortcomings in 10 out of 11 aspects of money laundering. And the goal of this as well is to be really a reference for everybody who is not an expert on Dubai. The role of Dubai in various illicit financial flows, gold flows, trade-based money laundering flows, and so forth, covers the world. Just to give you some ideas, if you're interested in issues of weapons of mass destruction, A.Q. Khan, the famous proliferator of Pakistani know-how in nuclear weapons, he based a lot of his financial and trade networks there. Iran runs a lot of its nuclear-related smuggling and sanctions busting firms from there. As a matter of fact, Department of Treasury just put out a notice on 2 other UAE firms. If you work on issues of organized crime, Dawood Ibrahim and D Company, which is a combination of organized crime and individuals associated with terrorism finance for Al-Qaeda related groups and Taliban related groups, runs a lot of his organizations out of there, even though he lives in Pakistan. Altaf Khanani, who was running money laundering from all over the world. He was money laundering for Latin American drug lords. He was money laundering for Hezbollah. You name it, he was doing money laundering for them. He was running $14 billion in money laundering per year as the estimate. He's currently in jail here in the United States. But that was also running to a large extent out of Dubai. Russian organized crime does a lot of its operations out of Dubai. If you're interested in VAT and CumEx trades and environmental credits, carbon credits and stuff, crime, a lot of that, like the carousel scandal, was running out of Dubai. Sanjay Shah, who is alleged at this point to have been involved in various VAT and CumEx trades, lives there. And a matter of fact, he parks his yacht there and named it CumEx. So he's not very subtle. The gold, I would like to note just briefly, because one of the things that's documented in the report is that gold is relatively easy to move into Dubai compared to other places. And I'll give a quick example of Venezuela. Venezuela used to run a lot of its gold into Miami for processing. As the United States has cracked down on Venezuelan gold, pushed for more due diligence of that gold because it's coming out of the Maduro regime, they've started shipping more and more of that gold, sometimes openly, sometimes not so openly, through Dubai. And so one wants to understand the sort of channels that, if you're in Venezuela, why would you move gold halfway around the world when there's plenty of places in the Western Hemisphere to process that? And Sean Bloor and Marcina Hunter did a wonderful job of noting not only how the gold comes through and how it's relatively easy to have one's gold declared conflict-free and then enter the markets, but also that one, particularly when it comes to gold from Africa, doesn't necessarily make a lot of money with the gold actually coming in the country, but it makes you really make your money from the trade-based money laundering. So you take your proceeds from the gold, you go down to the various markets, you purchase goods there, you have them shipped back, and that's really where you make your money. And if you can link it with some trade misinvoicing and so forth, associated with trade-based money laundering, you can make even more money out of that, particularly since Dubai is a major hub for Chinese exports. Many African traders, for example, don't actually travel all the way to China to purchase Chinese goods to bring back to African countries. They actually go to Dubai, and that is a big middle source between the two of them. Terrorism finance, my original background. If you've watched Rami Makhlouf versus the Assads, and that money and smuggling chains that are coming to light as these two sets of related families are fighting each other in Syria, a lot of that has very openly run through Dubai. And in some cases, major sanctioned smugglers for the Assad regime have been able to come to Dubai, even as the head of trade delegations. So again, not terribly subtle. We've got a whole report on the Taliban and Afghan warlords. And then I mentioned, kleptocracy like Isabel dos Santos, Dana Tete involved in alleged oil malfeasance and $1 billion bribe with Shell and ENI through Nigeria. All of these kind of come together. So we wanted to make a reference for all of those experts who don't normally work on the UAE or Dubai, but really need to understand it. If you're working Latin American drug, narcotics transfers and money laundering, but you're not a UAE expert, because why would you be? You work Latin America issues. Give that sort of reference that people can use and open up and understand. If you're media and understanding for an investigative journalism report, if you're civil society trying to understand what's going on in the country, that's really the purpose of this. It's essentially for everybody who doesn't know anything about the UAE. And the chapters and such are set up around that. So for example, Kristen Ulrichsen put together a nice, very short, understandable chapter on just the basics of how the UAE works. Again, for someone who's not a UAE expert, but needs enough to get by. Lakshmi's going to talk about her great work on free zones, which is a key to how Dubai operates. I mentioned the gold report that Sean Bloor and Marcina Hunter put together. Why would Venezuelan gold go to Dubai? What is the process one takes to import that gold? What kind of questions are asked about the gold? What kind of due diligence is done with that gold? Peter Kirichou, who at the time was with C4ADS, did some great work on real estate, because real estate is an incredibly important part of how Dubai survives. And also what we call gatekeepers in the country, lawyers, accountants, insurance firms, those are linked with it. Karen did a wonderful chapter understanding law enforcement. If someone is working law enforcement issues with the UAE and Dubai, why can it be so difficult at times to get certain information? And then Mustafa Qadri really looked at the role of human trafficking and the kafala system and so forth with Dubai. And it's really interesting in particular because he highlights how the royal family in Dubai has been able to use, in some ways, to commodify citizenship. 90% of Dubai is foreigners. and how foreigners get permission to come in requires certain sponsors that UAE citizens can do. And that allows them the ability to basically make money off of sponsoring other people coming in. And that becomes a real part of the social contract between the royal family and that 10% of the population that are Dubai citizens. And Matthew's done a great job on, what can we do about these sorts of policy issues in the country? Because Dubai is such an interesting location, and the UAE overall, as you note. Dubai itself has always had a history of smuggling and so forth, but it's not a place that we would, like if you were in the 1970s, would have said, yeah, this is going to be the next big Middle East trade entrepot and real estate entrepot and banking entrepot. There is no natural port there. It takes a lot of dredging to get that Jebel Ali and those ports to work. There's no fresh water there. For example, Singapore, one of its claims to fame was it was a place of fresh water. There's none of that in Dubai. There's nothing in the 70s that would have indicated it was going to be the country it was. It's just the trading and the narrative and so forth that has been created around Dubai that really makes the place work. And yet there's no rule of law. There's no accountability or transparency with the government in Dubai. It's very interesting. So while you can get your business contracts adjudicated under English common law in some cases, there's no guarantee actually that that position will remain there either for your business or for the system overall. There is no freedom of the press in the country. There is no political parties allowed. There is no civil society allowed in this country. It's a very strange parliament, a very almost like North Korean-like parliament where the government, the royal families of the UAE decide who can run for parliament, but they also decide who can vote for those who run for parliament. And then even then the parliament is only advisory. But at the same time, they work on this internal narrative and limit any free press. And yet they work very hard at an external narrative that Dubai still looked like this kind of shiny, great place to do business and stuff for the rest of the world. And so it's these interesting distinctions and this exceptionalism of Dubai and all that's wrapped up now with this Israel-UAE agreement that I think really makes this report very, very timely. And in particular, the issues of trade, which will be coming to the forefront on this UAE Israel trade agreement, which is why I'm so excited that Lakshmi could be here today, because she's really a tremendous expert on how the trade system works, the regulatory system works, and what we call regulatory capture.
Thank you so much, Jodi, for that great introduction of your fantastic report. I think one point that's also important to make is that a lot of European countries have key strategic interests in Dubai and the Emirates. The Emirates, of course, being one of Britain's last colonies, only gaining independence in 1971. The UK and France have big strategic interests there, and all of this is really relevant to a European audience as well. So I'd love now to bring in Lakshmi Kumar to talk about the role of Dubai's free trade zones and about the role of trade-based money laundering in the city's role as one of the capitals of global illicit finance. And I'd love it, Lakshmi, if you could explain to our audience a little bit more about what trade-based money laundering is, which I feel in our field is perhaps a slightly neglected part of international corruption, given its astounding scale.
No, thank you, Ben. And I'm glad to sort of come after Jodi, because Jodi's really sketched the breadth of the subject, and so it makes my job a lot easier. But sort of before I start, I'll just dive straight into what trade-based money laundering is. In sort of, when we think of money laundering, we think of finding ways to sort of essentially whitewash illicit activity by moving it through the financial system. And sort of, then, you invested in real estate, you invested in art, you invested in so many things to sort of hide the illicit origins of your money. Trade-based money laundering is sort of, it's one step higher, where you are essentially masking your illicit activity in the value of a good. So to break it down in a very simple example, let's say, I'm a drug lord sitting here in Washington, D.C. I collect my and drug profits very often are cash. They come out to sort of, millions of dollars in cash. Now, carrying duffel bags of cash across the border is impossible. Let's say you use that cash, you can buy a piece of gold. a military dog tag, which is about the size of like a small little gold biscuit, that alone is valued at current market rates close to 2,000 US dollars. And that is barely, it's less than a quarter-inch thick, and takes up no space. So to be able to convert your cash into gold and then take it across the border and to turn it in, use that gold to buy, let's say, a third commodity, move it across the border, and then repatriate it back into cash, that's trade-based money laundering. In the US, very often when we look at money laundering as it happens in the US, what will happen, especially with sort of narcotics, because that's where we see a lot of this happen, is that, you take the cash, you deposit to what is in the US is called like a broker, who will turn your cash into sort of, local currency, which is sort of like a peso or another form of currency. They then help finance and import or export of, let's say, cars. The cars are then sort of, exported from the US into Latin America, where someone purchases the cars. And then, when that money is then sort of sent over to Latin America, it's then reconverted back into US dollars. So the ways to move sort of through TBML are multivarious. Other mechanisms often involve, let's say, again, I am trying to sort of hide my illicit proceeds, and I'm sort of shipping gold across, but I don't want someone to know it's gold because, it's of illicit origin. So very often, maybe I'll mask it as coffee. I'll say I'm shipping coffee back into Colombia, and my invoice will say, hey, I've got coffee, that's what I'm shipping. Someone at customs clears it, but it's actually what you're shipping is gold. So you've managed to actually move your value to a traded good across borders, across jurisdictions. And this is not to say that a trade-based money laundering scheme goes from point A to point B. Much like a regular money laundering scheme, it can span 3 jurisdictions, 4 jurisdictions, 5 jurisdictions. A traded good can go from being cash to gold to cars back into cash. It could also, I think, in one very famous case that we've seen sort of come out of the US, it went from being cash into toys and then back into cash again. So, the trade-based money laundering, the schemes can stretch as far as your imagination. If you can conjure up something, that is a trade-based money laundering scheme, and there is no end to it. So I'm always sort of happy to sort of dig deep into this, but to sort of keep the conversation back to Dubai, why is the free zones of Dubai so important, and why should we care about it? Why does it matter? And I think it matters because, one, it is the juggernaut of Dubai's economy. Dubai's economy is built on its free zones. 32% of its foreign direct investment comes out of one single free zone in Dubai, which is the Jebel Arif free zone. That same free zone, one free zone, accounts for 24% of the Emirates' GDP. And this is an emirate that has 40 different free zones. So it gives you a sense of the size and scale and value of free zones to the economy. And I think the next question is then, okay, so there are free zones. Yes, it's valuable to the economy. Why does it still matter? It still matters because every problem that Jodi has highlighted passes through the free zone. So when you talk about AQCon, you talk about proliferation financing. Why does it go through free zones? Proliferation financing traditionally goes through free zones because free zones have much lower barriers of entry. They're not subject to the same requirements. And very often, doing something like proliferation financing is illegal through a free zone because it's such a high-risk activity. But people choose to do it through a free zone because there are no law enforcement officials within a free zone. That's why you do it. When we talk about some of the other work that so many of our authors have done in this report, like human trafficking, why is it again in a free zone? Because free zones purposefully lower labor laws so that you don't pay minimum wage. You don't have to trade unions aren't allowed. You can make people work overtime. And it means it's a perfect vehicle for you to allow human trafficking, where people very often don't have the rights and recourse to actually go to a court because the court system is separated from the mainland. That's a problem. When you're talking about illicit gold activity, again, where does it happen? The Dubai Multi-Commodity Center is one of the most valuable free zones. It has over $200 billion in trade flow that go through the Dubai Multi-Commodity Center, but it has under 10 suspicious activity reports that have been filed by the DMCC to its own financial intelligence unit. And all of this is especially shocking because when you look at Dubai as an emirate, most of its commercial and financial activity is out of its free zones. In Dubai, of the close to 5,000 companies that exist, only 710 are registered on the mainland. Everything else operates out of the free zone. And then when you start, and for us as researchers, when we then start looking at the fact of evaluation, you see there is actually no information coming out of the free zone. Over a span of 3 years or sometimes 5 years, we've only seen 100 suspicious cases that the free zones report to their own government, which means that if you're the government and that's the bulk of your financial activity, you are not asking yourself the questions you should be asking. And that brings us to the next logical step. Why aren't you asking those questions? And the case in Dubai is that the roles between regulation and promotion are one and the same. The Dubai royal family controls most of the regulatory structure. So Dubai Financial Services Board is directly appointed by the family. All the free zones very proudly advertise their trade facilitation, which is how easy it is to set up a company. A lot of them, including the DMCC, have draft anti-money laundering guidelines that have never been formalized. So there are so many structures in place that ensure that the goals of the free zones aren't actually to promote and foster a strict environment that is free of illicit activity. It's very on before, because the two compete with each other. It is the desire to regulate and supervise versus the desire to make Dubai an investment hub. They exist within the same institution, and one clearly has always won over, which is to make sure that Dubai is an investment hub, because Dubai, every year on year, both the DMCC and some of its largest free zones have only grown exponentially in number of companies they've registered and the number of proceeds that are flowing through it. And in all of this, I suppose the last thing I want to sort of mention here is why the Israel deal is particularly interesting, because it's estimated right now that trade between Israel and the UAE can go around sort of, I think on the import side, about 300,000. That's expected to go into the hundreds of millions of dollars. And for a country that sort of post-COVID has lost 52 billion out of its economy, that presents interesting opportunities. I think something for us to consider and examine is also sort of the political place that Israel is in, sort of the things that Netanyahu, a lot of backlash that Netanyahu is facing domestically, and what sort of having an open economy to sort of what it means for sort of the allegations of corruption against him vis-a-vis the opportunities that sort of, may or may not present itself with an alliance with a place like Dubai that affords a lot more opportunities for certain open trade, but it's also secret trades to take place. But I will leave it with that and then let the rest of this panel continue.
Thank you so much. That's a brilliant analysis and really, really interesting and important for our audience. I'd like to now turn to Karen Greenaway to talk about the law enforcement issues and how the US government and allied democracies can maybe begin to tackle some of these problems and what's going wrong in Dubai's own law enforcement failures. Thank you, Karen, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you very much for including me in this panel. And I want to thank both Jodi and Matthew and Lakshmi for giving their side of the report. I have to admit, I was a reluctant participant in writing this report, in part because I've never participated in something like this before, and also because I had a lot of experience with Dubai as it related to transnational organized crime, as it related to money laundering. But I'd never done an analysis, quite like this in the way that, law enforcement, for me, it was very much an educational process as much as it was, and an informative process as much as it was kind of a laying out of my own expertise. So, in looking at Dubai, originally we were kind of trying to look at, in general, UAE, but as Jodi pointed out, the problem is that Dubai itself came up as the hub for so many, competing illegal interests. And so my question, that I went in with was, well, why is this? I'd had my own experience. The units that I worked with in the FBI, the Transnational Organized Crime Unit and the International Corruption Unit, had their experiences with Dubai, and our attempts to, when I was in the Bureau, really work with Dubai related to those particular problems, those particular illegal activities. I will say, as I affirmed in my report, there's no question that certainly as it relates to counterterrorism, to an extent, Dubai is a very cooperative partner. And has coordinated, and has kind of taken the lead almost in the Middle East in being cooperative as it relates to that particular problem. My own assessment of that is that that's also very much in Dubai's and the UAE's self-interest. But what about these other problems? As Jodi highlighted, instantaneously when Isabella dos Santos knew she was going to lose her job, she was out of her country with her money, having cleaned out all of her, her financial interest in the country. And the problem is because Dubai is has become such a great part of the international financial money movements, structure that is out there, that it's now become easy to send money into Dubai with little accountability for how the money gets there. So what I looked at when I did my report was I said, well, what are the structures? What are the law enforcement structures? Let me see what I can find, on open source and just looking, as it relates to how does Dubai answer international requests for evidence? How does Dubai, respond to law enforcement cooperation? And I was quite shocked to find that Dubai and the UAE have signed just about every agreement you can sign. They have assigned, and ratified the UN Convention on Anti-Corruption. They are participants on the OECD foreign bribery. They are involved in a number of these international conventions related to drug trafficking and narcotics. And so I said, okay, well, when you are a signator to these, to these institutions, to these treaties, you have obligations that you are supposed to implement in your country. And particularly if you are a member of, or have signed on to the Financial Action Task Force, 40 recommendations. Now, officially, the UAE is only a member of a sub-organization of FATF, as it's called. But in actuality, that means you still have to live up to, leading an entity called the Financial Intelligence Unit that collects, or supposed to be submitting, so in theory, Isabella dos Santos, you should be sending to your FIU, some sort of report that says, Isabella dos Santos has just put $40 million into our bank accounts, and we think this is a problem. And what I found repeatedly was, as it relates to white collar, money laundering, trade, customs, there's a complete lack of transparency as to enforcement, as to structure, as to, even finding cases that have been done, in terms of large scale cases. It's completely absent. There is no reporting. And in fact, it's very difficult to even determine who is responsible in law enforcement to enforce the laws. So, if presumably, which one of the articles that I found that I highlighted in my report, you've got, as Lakshmi talked about, gold smuggling, and you have Nepal, which has been able to put together a very, extensive gold smuggling case which ties directly back to, lack, or completely unenforced, customs laws in Dubai. There should be people in Dubai who got charged with that smuggling case, as there were people in Nepal, as well as India. And in fact, nobody in Dubai was charged in this massive case. There were people who were murdered as a part of this organization. There was a police officer who was killed as a part of this operation, yet nobody in Dubai faced any charges. And the Nepalese came out and made a big deal about the report. They talked about it, they showed what happened. And it was kind of an open question in the press, like, okay, so what's going to happen on the other side of this, where this originated in Dubai? And the answer was nothing happened. So the reality of it is that while the UAE is a signatory to all of these conventions, they should be implementing all of these, laws and rules. I should backtrack and say they implemented some of them administratively where it was in the best interest in guarding the royal family's interests. So, for example, they implemented some anti-corruption measures in the country, but they put it into the audit committee to enforce, as opposed to put it into, the Ministry of the Interior or law enforcement to enforce. And it's strictly focused on waste, fraud, and abuse within the procurement process within the government of UAE and therefore in Dubai. So nobody's going to go to jail, for these investigations. Somebody might be fined, but it's more along the lines that somebody has taken advantage of the royal family, and so there must be some sort of consequences for that. Finding out who is judges who handle cases or anything related to, Dubai's enforcement was very difficult. On the other hand, Dubai does spend a lot of money on the daily enforcement of crime. For example, petty crime, traffic violations, and they pride themselves on being a very, citizen, kind of electronic engagement friendly police and law enforcement, which is not cheap. For example, one of the things that they have said is that, by, and I forget the year was, and within the next 10 years, they want to have something like 25% of their police force be robots, human AI robots. Those are not cheap expenses. But yet, on the other hand, I couldn't find, a unit that did financial crimes and money laundering. I couldn't find a unit that was devoted to guarding the financial security of the UAE. And then, of course, you have the other challenges, with Dubai and the UAE, and that is, you have allegations of torture against individuals who've been arrested. You have allegations that the UAE is become one of the most, government surveillance friendly countries in the world in terms of the amount of cameras and monitoring that they've implemented. So on the one hand, you have this very, almost authoritarian oversight of the country through these mechanisms, and being willing to utilize, techniques that law enforcement, in the United States, Europe, the UK is absolutely prohibited from using, and in fact harms the cases that you would be doing. And at the same time, they have zero enforcement under the United Nations Conventions Against Torture. And so what you see in the FATF review, the Financial Action Task Force review, is finally a recognition that Dubai is and the UAE is completely failing at their obligations to enforce anti-money laundering laws and collect suspicious activity report information, which has an impact not just in Dubai and the UAE, but it impacts around the world. Because then if I'm, a law enforcement officer in the United States, and I want to make a request through the United States FIU, which is called FinCEN, to get suspicious activity report from Dubai, there's nothing to get. So my experience, in the FBI, and our experience in the FBI, is that we would send international requests to Dubai for evidence, collection of bank records, anything, so that we could complete the evidence that we needed to make some of our cases, and you would never get a response, because even the mechanism to answer those responses is not funded, developed, and even created in some instances to handle those responses. And so, whereas if you work with a Singapore, as Jodi, brought up, they have a phenomenal, setup within their government to be, quick, thorough, and complete in answering international requests for evidence. There's no similarities with Dubai. As a result, what happens, is that the collection of evidence goes into a black hole. And so countries like Nigeria, which has been, Matthew's focus, has lost a lot of their money to, politically exposed persons, from Nigeria, who've put it into Dubai. And so the current president of Nigeria actually went to the UAE and said, look, we are fellows from this part of the world. We have relationships here. We want to coordinate with you on this problem of corruption. And there was a big dinner, and everybody kumbaya'd and talked and sat, and nothing happened. Not a single new case, no evidence. On the other hand, when Dubai wants to, they can give you a subject generally related to narcotics, but again, it's very selective. So how I saw it after looking at all of this is, while the UAE and Dubai understand and have accepted, the obligations that they have under these treaties, under the FATF, obligations and recommendations, and they have the funding to fund those, mechanisms to enforce those recommendations, to enforce their obligations, they make a conscious choice not to do that. And so as a result, for a law enforcement officer in any country who's trying to do cases related to money laundering, corruption, transnational organized crime, certain weapons trafficking cases, you name it, Dubai becomes the place that you can't get evidence. And that means that people don't go to jail who should go to jail. We don't get the illicit assets back that we should get back. And then, of course, there's the whole issue of all of the illicit assets that exist in Dubai, that have been purchased with money, stolen from, communities around the world that could use that for healthcare, just basic human rights, requirements, food, water, et cetera, that's sitting in Dubai in this very expensive real estate, which is, of course, is another issue about as it relates to the non-transparency, of purchases, how they're handled, who's actually owns them, banks' obligations in terms of filing. So to me, the real shocker was the amount of, of money that is out there to go to law enforcement in Dubai and UAE that's just not spent on that. And that means that, there's just this huge black hole of enforcement that becomes the UAE when it comes to, some of the really bad actors that we see around the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, for such a brilliant overview of the egregious law enforcement problems that we are faced with emanating from Dubai. Just before turning to Matthew Page for what are the solutions to this problem, I thought it would be a good moment to mention that the Western Alliance is a security provider for the Emirates. Not only does the United States have a considerable military presence in the country with bases there, France has a base with over 650 troops, and the UK, Australia, and Italy all run operations from Al Minhad Air Base in the Emirates. So it's very interesting to see yet again a case of a country where the West is a security provider to a country that is an actor or an enabler of financial insecurity. So I'd love to hear from Matthew what the solutions look like, what leverage there is here. What should we do about this situation in Dubai and in the Emirates?
The fantastic setup in terms of talking about sort of the policy relevance, right, and the, in a sense, the catch-22 that Western policymakers have when they are thinking about the UAE and the multiplicity of issues, but also, being put on the hot seat to try to come up with some solutions or policy recommendations for these really, really intractable challenges. What I think was great about the comments so far is they really have already outlined the three major policy challenges that we talk about in the report. But then I'm going to talk about a fourth one, a sort of a shadow challenge, if you will, that that we've already really pointed to, which has more to do with Western powers, the US, UK, European countries, and their approach to sort of Middle East policy in general. And that was really outside the scope of our report, but it's, I think, in this venue worth talking about, given everything that's happening in the region today. So the first challenge, we obviously we touched on at great length. Lakshmi really kind of explained it in the context of the free port system, the free zone system in Dubai, which is the Emirates' deep economic dependence on global illicit financial flows and other problematic activities such as the kafala system, the human trafficking element that that Jodi mentioned at the start of our discussion. The second, of course, is an issue that we've all already alluded to in various contexts, which is Dubai and the UAE have an extraordinarily high degree of sensitivity to international criticism and an extremely aggressive sort of take no prisoners approach towards protecting its reputation. You will not be surprised to hear that heavily shaped our planning and execution of what at the end of the day is a very wonky sort of research-based endeavor with this paper. We realized that just talking about this topic, broaching it, getting together experts was an extremely sensitive task and could potentially put people at risk. Just to sort of deviate for a moment from the actual substance of our discussion, I think it's really clear that when you are someone who studies corruption and malfeasance by very powerful governments or powerful people, you have to be really careful, just not only to protect yourself, but also not put people who are present in the region or travel to the region in danger. So that was really, really very much in our consciousness as we put together this paper. And that's why it was fantastic. We had people like Karen Greenaway, who had worked, with the region from a law enforcement standpoint and had that experience that she could bring to the table and into the discussions and the written product at the end. Karen falls herself short. Her chapter is excellent and beautifully written, and a fantastic first contribution in her think tank chapter of her career now. So. And Karen's chapter and her comments earlier really outline the gap, or the cognitive gap almost, between Dubai's robust law enforcement capacity and its unwillingness to use it to stem illicit financial flows. And I'll talk about this a little bit later, but I mean, I think that what's very, very clear is that the Emiratis are really at best negligent or at worst complicit in regards to tackling the issue of corruption and illicit financial flows through Dubai. At the end of the day, that is an important problem, an international problem that they need to address. And then there's that fourth sort of invisible challenge, which we don't really dive into in the paper, but it's really important to mention, and especially within the context of policy solutions. And that is, the somewhat sort of cognitive dissonance that exists when it comes to Western policymakers' conventional wisdom with regard to the UAE. And Ben, your comments are teeing up me a moment ago really sort of pointed to that, right? In the sense that, it's an important military partner for Western countries. It's an important economic and trade partner. As Jodi mentioned, all major international banks have a significant footprint in Dubai because it's this sort of global financial node. So there is this very sort of Western facing and very first world role which Dubai plays in policymaking circles. As Jodi likes to mention, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis called the Emirates, the U.S.'s little Sparta in the region because it punches beyond its weight. I was reading a moment ago that the U.S. is really pushing hard to make a significant sale of F-35 fighter jets to the UAE under this administration. So again, all that reinforces how, in a way, the primary way that Western policymakers view the UAE, and it isn't through the lens of corruption. It's not through the lens of human trafficking. It's not through the lens of gold trafficking or other illicit financial flows. And I think that those of us who are working on anti-corruption issues or trying to positive policy changes in the international space need to understand that. And that's something that we were very careful as we tooled the policymaker recommendations in this paper, which I'll get to in a moment. We were very careful to sort of frame those in that context. As we've all mentioned so far, the recent normalization of Israeli-UAE relationships only take this dynamic to a whole nother level, right? And now the UAE has made itself sort of in a very real way sort of indispensable to Western countries' sort of vision of a peaceful and prosperous region. A problem here, and needless to say, I would say this, or in the sense I'm biased, is I think this strategic policymaking calculus that Washington and other capitals have is very one-dimensional, lacks sophistication, is sort of rooted in almost a sort of an autopilot approach to Middle East policy. And it really ignores the Emirates and specifically Dubai's problematic, the sort of second and third order effects of Dubai's role in facilitating illicit financial flow. And we could talk all day, and the paper goes into great depth about these in Jodi's chapter, amongst others, which is, situations like Nigerian elites, bleeding the country's, public coffers dry in order to buy luxury property in Dubai, no questions asked, or the excellent chapter in the paper about gold trafficking and the illicit gold trade, and how that really fuels conflict, communal conflict, resource-based conflict in East and Central Africa. All of these things matter to Western governments as well. What they've done is they've failed, again, it's sort of a cognitive dissonance where they've failed to see the cause and effect of Dubai's problematic behaviors with regard to these other security threats, whether it be, and then you can also talk about the conflict in Afghanistan, counter-proliferation issues. Again, Dubai, as Karen mentioned, Dubai features in all of these really problematic behaviors, and again is a central character in all of those Shakespearean dramas, if you will. So Western policymakers need to wake up to that. That was one of our motivations for really pulling together this piece, was to, in a sense, peel back the varnish or the veneer that the Emirati government has very effectively layered upon itself to distract from these really harmful issues. Pulls together what we think are 5 very feasible policy recommendations that anti-corruption practitioners, policymakers, international organizations, and other non-governmental entities can key on in order to deter and prevent illicit financial flows from transiting through, or as as Lakshmi talked about, being absorbed by Dubai and being translated into shiny skyscrapers full of luxury apartments that kleptocrats from around the world can then purchase. So the aim of putting together these recommendations was to give anti-corruption, the anti-corruption community, people like ourselves, workable approaches, workable ideas that wouldn't antagonize the broader policy community, while also gently nudging it to redefine its relationships with the Gulf. And there's the beginnings of a dialogue within Middle East policy circles to talking a little bit more about a two-way street approach, a sort of give and take within the relationship with both the UAE, but also countries within the region as a whole. So our policy recommendations are as follows. The first is a very outside-in approach, I would say, which is that Western governments should use the tools they already have, the sanction tools, the sticks, if you will, in terms of characteristics, to target UAE-based corruption facilitators with travel and financial sanctions. But again, these are people who are not necessarily Emirati, not necessarily affiliated with these very, prickly and sensitive cast of characters who do not want to have their reputations tarnished by association with corruption, but rather these kleptocrats, criminal elements from around the world that use Dubai. There should be a more concerted effort to target those individuals with tools like the Global Magnitsky Act, or in the US's case, Presidential Proclamation 7750, which is a visa sanction tool, and other visa sanction tools. And particularly looking at the money laundering and gold smuggling that, again, can have very significant regional impacts in terms of fueling conflict and human misery in underdeveloped parts of the world. The second is that Western governments need to do a better job championing regional civil society groups in the UAE and in the broader region, because part of the challenge is, and that we noticed is, again, because there's such an aggressive effort to crack down on criticism and dissent in these countries, you don't have that sort of rich network of civil society activists that international organizations or anti-corruption activists can tap into. And there needs, rather than sort of charging at the Emirati government head on over this issue, there should be a greater effort to sort of broaden the dialogue out and, enable local credible voices to sort of chime in on the discussion. The third is that international organizations should really increase their constructive scrutiny of Dubai. So that's the United Nations, the OECD, the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF and the World Bank. They need to take a much harder look at Dubai's role in facilitating international financial flows, just as the Financial Action Task Force recently did with the report that the previous speakers had mentioned in some depth. So that report is an excellent start. There needs to be sort of more of that type of constructive scrutiny, and through mechanisms where there can be sort of fairly objective measures of holding institutions, Emirati institutions, accountable over their shortcomings when it comes to reporting and preventing corruption and financial crime. Quickly, fourth, international organizations and civil society groups and Western governments really need to do a better job at distancing themselves from efforts by Dubai and the Emirati government to primp the Emirates' reputation. So many of us were to use a British term, gobsmacked, astounded by the fact that the eighth session of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption was held in Abu Dhabi in December 2019. So again, individuals who care about these issues and governments who care about these issues should not be buying into a very concerted and deliberate strategy by the Emirati government and institutions there to whitewash their reputation. Instead, they should politely decline those invitations or make it clear why they're doing so. And sort of as a extent, international companies, for example, those that are sponsoring next year's Expo 2020, obviously postponed because of the coronavirus epidemic, they should really weigh the reputational risks that an event designed to sort of celebrate Dubai entails and consider withdrawing their sponsorship. This is a reputational risk for high-profile international sponsors of Expo 2020 and other events in Dubai. Companies like Accenture, Cisco, MasterCard, Pepsi, and Siemens have all signed on to be major sponsors of Expo 2020, and they're, I think, should be seen as real reputational risks for doing so until Dubai addresses issues like the illicit financial flows, but also human trafficking and just general civil rights in the country. So those are the 5 real, what we think are sort of feasible, reasonable, not pie in the sky policy recommendations that came out of this report. And again, if Western governments, international institutions, all of us listening in today can sort of move in those general directions, I think some positive movement on this issue is possible. But one final issue I want to touch on before handing the microphone back to Ben for his sort of discussant role time would be to really talk about something I was thinking of as Lakshmi was discussing the issue of free ports. And that is, living here in the UK, I'm really acutely aware of how some of the issues that we've discussed in terms of Dubai's problematic role in facilitating corruption and financial flows really have domestic policy implications for countries like the UK in certain respects. One is the UK's plan to create free ports, for example, and how, again, regardless of what potential safeguards are put in place, and I haven't really heard much in terms of the policy discussion domestically that certain safeguards are really going to be put into place, using sort of Dubai as a cautionary tale, that many of the same challenges and problems that we see in Dubai could really be replicated in places like the UK or other countries that in a sense try to emulate the Emirati or Dubai model. So I'll leave it at that, and maybe that can serve as a bit of a springboard into some of the discussion between us and Ben. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I think that's all we've got time for now. We've hit our 60-minute slot. So thank you, Jodi Vittori, Matthew Page, Karen Greenaway, and Lakshmi Kumar for such a brilliant exposition of the dark side of Dubai and outlining these fantastic solutions that are indeed highly practical for trying to peel back the glitter as we move ahead towards the Expo due to be hosted in the Emirates. Thank you.